The two of us who are going to speak first are David Jaffee, who is a professor here as well as head of new media research, and myself. I've been trying to keep on Carmitas. And so we are the two most recent curators in the Focus Gallery project. And this year in particular, we really invested in thinking about how to do digital interpretation in our galleries, and to think about not only what it might mean to have a screen, but also to create a digital publication in lieu of a paper book, or to create a web app that was functional both outside of the space of the gallery and then uniquely functional inside of the space, and how to create connections between the objects in the space and these digital interactives so that the two experiences, both physical and virtual, weren't separate and distinct from one another. And I think Jen gave us a great example of how that can be done. And the Art Lens is a phenomenal example of being able to enhance the objects and work within the user experience. And so those are things we've been really pushing. We've been really enjoying. The student involvement has been phenomenal. David and I think we have a lot of ideas and we feel really good about things, and the students come up with ideas and it's like, oh my God, this is so much better than we could have ever thought. And that's the benefit of having the Focus Gallery program, and being able to work with students over a number of semesters and to really get their input. And so you'll see the fruits of that labor. David will talk about visualizing 19th century New York, and then I will talk about the interface experience. And then we'll take a quick little break after that, and then we'll go into a panel discussion where the speakers from this morning, David, myself, and then the speakers from yesterday, Deborah Douglas and Jonathan Dahan, will also join us to chat up front and then to also take your questions. So without further ado, David.
Thanks, Kimon. And want to thank Kimon for just such a thought-provoking day and a half, as well as the exhibit, which I think, also starting last Thursday when I first got a glimpse of it, has really helped. And it is an interesting process of sort of bookends, and it'll be interesting after our two presentations in the panel discussion to maybe try to make some sense of what outwardly are very different projects, but I think in many ways are not in terms of the goals of the Focus Gallery and the Digital Media Lab. And my thanks also to colleagues Ivan Gaskell, who's here, who's head of the Focus Gallery project, as well as Ann Tarsinis, who's been here at various times, who also was curator for the Focus Gallery project. Because they, along with many other of the gallery staff, really were, I don't know how many times I was in Ivan's office, it's like, what can I do about this, or what can I do with this, or how am I going to make sense of this, or I've never done an exhibit from beginning to end. And I think the Focus Gallery project, which you've heard about already, is interesting because it's really at the intersection of several of the projects and goals we have at the BGC. We have a mission through the DML of experimenting with new technologies. We're also trying to sort of think about new modes of digital presentation of scholarship, which could be both in exhibition form as well as in digital publications or other types of digital things that we can talk about. And then the third piece of this is also my own interest in thinking about and presenting ideas and work that I'm doing along with my students, because this is really part of my teaching and research portfolio about 19th century New York. And so those are the things I'm going to talk about. As you know, the whole goal of the Focus Gallery project, which started in 2011, was for faculty-student curated exhibitions where faculty and students could work in different disciplines, from the very first exhibit we had by a colleague, Aaron Glass, on Northwest Coast peoples and the encounter there, to use the format of the temporary exhibition to convey the central argument of their scholarship. And then the Digital Media Lab that Kimon spoke about yesterday, too, was started in 2009, again for faculty, students, and staff to experiment with new technologies and to innovate in little did we know how much this would mean in our coursework, research, pedagogy. And so pedagogy is an important piece of this afternoon as well, that we're both going to highlight. Because if anything, these are really student, faculty-generated projects, and I think that's their great glory. It's a wonderful teaching environment, as I think will come across, hopefully in my account, as well as Kimon's, and I think you'll see in some of the student work in the Visualizing 19th Century New York. And there are also collaborative projects which have involved working with other institutions. So I wanted to talk about very briefly, you're wondering about this slide, I was too cheesy not to put in a title slide. So this sort of begins with the first iteration of a Material Culture of 19th Century New York digital exhibition. These New York City projects will really have been important for me in exploring new modes of presentation, which I'm very interested in. It doesn't necessarily sit totally naturally with me now to think about, as I've been presenting my work at different universities and venues, that this work on 19th century New York and different entrepreneurs that you'll see who created visual commodities that went into the middle class parlor, like stereo views, like illustrated newspapers, like daguerreotypes and early paper photographs, should naturally come out in a book form. I mean, that is, for generations, has been obviously the default. But it's something that is increasingly spatially organized, study of New York. I don't think that's really natural. Has to be that way. Of course, it's natural, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so we've really been exploring at the BGC student digital exhibition project. So the very first iteration of this 19th century New York material culture course was with this Omeka project that you can see here. One of the students worked on stereo views, and it was really a mixture of trying to sort of use at this especially early form of Omeka, which was a somewhat straitjacketed form. And as again, and this is another, and this might very well be true with the Focus Gallery exhibit that I'll get to very soon, is that these, to my mind, in talking to students, I try to explain these are also academic projects. So maybe I'm just covering my rear and saying why there's so much text. But these were generated for course projects. And for course, let's be honest, course evaluations too. And so I was looking for some command of the material, some discussion of what those sources might be, as well as something that was visually arresting and communicated the ideas in visual form. And that's a lot to ask. And students could pipe up later and say maybe it's too much to ask, and it's totally unfair, though I would argue that's not the case, because the results prove that. But so here, this is obviously very text-heavy. It uses at this point, the limited number of templates that Omeka, which is an open source exhibition and database program coming out of the Center for History and New Media at George Mason. And so students here were sort of working, and some of the problems that came up in this early iteration of this New York City project was that we didn't really have a common language for talking about digital exhibitions. One is I wasn't that familiar myself, perhaps, and second, we really had a problem, I would say, even though I thought the work was very good, in thinking about something that was more integrated and sustained. So in the next year, we sort of moved to a BGC NYPL digital exhibition, which this time we used sort of what became the case for the Focus Gallery later, a 2-semester sequence. And in the fall, we worked with Josh Greenberg, who was then at the NYPL, in thinking about how to use the collections. So in the fall, students, every other week we met at the NYPL at a different collection. So it was really important that we immerse ourselves in what the photographic and print collection looked like, or what rare books had to offer, and not just use the incredible resources of the NYPL Digital Gallery, which is unparalleled on many, aside from American Memory, but still it was important to have us look and feel, literally feel some of those materials. And so we ended up, and this is the beginning of my interest along with the students in a sort of spatial representation, that the interface to this one way of getting at things, and this is just a slide, not the actual site, but each one of those flags represents a different mini exhibit. There are 6 mini exhibits that pairs of students worked on to create this. So we didn't have an overall exhibit. We had a series of different pockets according to student interest. So it wasn't totally integrated, which didn't bother me at all. And we created this, Josh and Mark created this in JavaScript, if I remember correctly, fairly laboriously coding this. And what was one of the other interesting parts of this is two students were really fascinated with guidebooks, which they saw as one of the archetypal texts to understand New York. What better way to understand New York but than by a guidebook which tries to explicate to both New Yorkers as well as visitors what the experience of visiting New York was like, how to sort of put into words and images. But what they felt, and you can't really see here, is in a subsequent part of their exhibit, was they shot a video in the, I think it was in the Rare Book Room, of what it was like to work with a guidebook. They really wanted people to understand the experiential quality of just turning the pages. And they felt at that point that a video would be the best means of, presenting and passing along that experiential quality. And I think they were very successful in thinking about, and as you can see here, we had, well, you actually can't see too well anything here at the bottom. Some of the mini exhibits were about different maps and representations of various blocks in New York and so on, as well as this one, which was about guidebooks. And so what we were pushing against and not really able to totally do in this form was really attack the sort of experiential quality of what it was like to be in 19th century New York. It just didn't come across. A video was the closest we could do this. And so when the Focus Gallery opportunity came along, I thought this would really be another. And so obviously Advantage here has been working on this for several years, different course iterations. So there's a great familiarity with the topic, familiarity with the materials that are possible, as well as different challenges that came up in teaching with these materials, which is a great boon. So it was really not starting from scratch, though maybe the students felt like it was in the sequence. And so we had, again, a year-long course where we started in the fall to work out what some of the themes. I mean, another whole angle here is not just becoming familiar for the students with what the different technical processes. What's a lithograph? How does a lithograph operate? If we're going to write panels, if we're going to write labels about lithographs, we have to be able to explain to the public what those are about. And so I think that's very important as well. And then also the individuals or companies that are involved, as well as the New York social history involved. If it's an exhibit about New York and we're trying to do a sort of cultural and social history of 19th century New York in the mid part of the century, we have to explain how the city's organized. How do these cultural entrepreneurs? So the way we ended up organizing this is you came into a gallery here, and what we were trying to convey in that introductory gallery was how New York was a visual experience. It was a spectacle. New York entrepreneurs used woodcuts, they used lithographs, they used photographs to make sense of the booming metropolis, and increasingly New York pumped out these goods to a national, indeed international audience. And those images came to represent what a modern city looked like. That was one of the arguments. How do we do that? We also wanted to talk about mass production techniques. Production was very important because we organized the exhibit. As you stepped into the galleries, you were in the gallery, you would go around Broadway. This was the sort of fiction that you'd walk along Broadway and encounter the different storefronts of these four leading entrepreneurs who created a vast number of visual images of New York. So it's really New York in general, Broadway in particular, were the site of these leading entrepreneurs. And they are figures like Currier Knives. These are not unknown firms. Currier Knives in their lithography firm, Matthew Brady in his daguerreotypes, and then his gallery. And so you see here, or Edward Anthony in this case, who's the producer of thousands of different unique images, and multiple thousands of many of those, of New York street scenes, important intersections, and other places. And then you end with a composite parlor that we created, which is where all these objects would have ended up, where you would have had your stereo viewer on this center table, along with your copy of Harper's. So the serial press, Harper's in particular, Frank Leslie's and others, also became another important medium for these images to circulate. Okay, so that was the goal in the gallery. So what did we do in terms, and here's Harper Brothers, which you can see as well. You can see as well the wood engravings that were again produced in the tens of thousands for Harper's, which also had a national circulation. Matthew Brady as well, and so this was an enlarged repro of Brady's gallery. So we mostly focused on production spaces. We were also interested in display spaces, places like these galleries or the Crystal Palace, department stores where people would have encountered these goods and learned how to want them. Because that's, again, not just to be assumed. There's, why should I want to buy this? And what became also important to us is the story. So this story that you can see here is organized about the sort of high and mighty. It's organized around the leading entrepreneurs who, like Currier and Ives, are Harper Brothers household names. But students and I really also wanted to tell the story of behind the scenes. What about the people who actually made all those goods? Matthew Brady, called Brady of Broadway, he didn't make those. Wasn't the operator behind the camera. So what about the people who made the operatives in the case of the camera, or the women who pasted on the albumin prints for the Anthony stereo views? So one of the keys here was also producing interactives that were in the gallery. And so one of the two was behind the scenes. And I just want to show you briefly the process, because what I thought was so fascinating is we spent a good chunk of the year, the students did, conceptualizing those gallery interactives, like how should we tell that story? Once we hit upon behind the scenes, that's cool, but how do we actually tell that story? What images do we use? And so here you can see the basic organization. We decided, really the students did all this. I shouldn't even say we. I should say they put together, and so we'd have these 5 different, we added parlor furniture in the center as a sort of 5th company, because parlors are the destination. And then students in that team, so we divided up into 3 different teams. And so in the case of the Anthony factory, we have these wonderful interior views from one of their catalogs. So really blessed with, now I'm not saying this is a realistic image of everything within that shop, but it at least gives you some prescriptive idea of what they're claiming it looks like. And you can talk here about division of labor, you can talk about gender division of labor, you can talk about the different steps of processes. And we wanted to start out, and what is the interface to that entire interactive is this cross-section of Harper's establishment on Pearl Street, which is a literal beehive of activity. Again, I think this is fictionalized, though printing presses are at the bottom, which makes sense because of their mass, and then the books as they are produced move up the chain, the food chain, so to speak. And so here, the students hit upon the really great idea of these hot spots to explain, because we really wanted to explain to visitors things that we couldn't really do in the gallery itself on the wall. They would just be too cumbersome and to some extent not beside the point. So this was really a way to literally look behind the storefronts. If the storefronts are what's in the gallery that tells you the story of the entrepreneurs and what they made, how would you look behind those storefronts? And so the interactive really allowed us to sort of use a variety of more materials, more images, some text, and to tell that story by interactive presentation, by letting visitors move through the touch screens and learn about different parts of the Anthony process, or at least as much about the technical process as they want to know, which might be very little. Or in this case, again, maybe not. So again, by visual as well as textual means, explaining more. I'm going to jump. The other interactive, which was really interesting, which was in the introductory gallery, was, okay, so behind the scenes is great. It tells you something that you can't see. What about the experience of how New York changed both geographically as a city, as an urban institution? We know Well, it gets more crowded, more people show up, but also the relentless northward push of New York. So we wanted to pick an intersection. Or again, one of the students, Laura, said, Broadway and Ann, that's what it's got to be. It's at the foot of City Hall Park. This is when we mapped out all the various establishments that were listed in the exhibit. That was sort of the key place. So this was the place we decided to tell the story of how that area changed over time. So we're telling the social economic story of these establishments, but we're also telling the visual story of how representations of those places changed. And of course, the whole point of the exhibit is those go together. These businesses succeed because they sell visual images. And so we're really trying to sort of play back and forth with that. So again, this is from a PowerPoint. Students created these elaborate PowerPoints. They weren't really happy with just finding the materials and writing the text, which we could have done in a Word document. They mapped out in these really elaborate PowerPoints how they wanted these interactives to work, how they wanted images to slide into other images, how they wanted text to appear. And when we went to a wonderful group of developers, Chips, and hired them to do this, they really took these PowerPoints and put them worked from them in a really pretty close approximation of the student work, which when they came back to show us their results, I think Kimon and I and the students were, pretty amazed that it looked slicker, which is what we wanted, but it looked in its guts, intellectually and design-wise, looked a lot like the student PowerPoints. So again, you can see we're using hotspots as a means of there's a good amount of text here. We used, in this case, they hit upon using period text, contemporary quotes from these guidebooks and other places about the astonishment of how the city operated as a place. And so, speaking of place, the last thing I really wanted to mention about the exhibit was it was also our first digital publication. For most of our Focus Gallery projects, we have really wonderfully written, designed, published books that come out like Kimon's. I wanted to sort of experiment with something different. I thought it was just an interesting thing to do, and you'll see why I thought that was a good idea. So we hit upon, with the students, using as the interface, and it also was in the introductory gallery, this 6 to 8 foot tall map by Matthew Drips. It is the first, as you can see from the right-hand detail, it is the first lot-by-lot representation of New York. Not block by block, but lot by lot. So you can literally see what the spaces are marked out, what buildings occupy those lots, what land is not used, and so on. So it's a wonderful index of what New York looks like, but it's also a stunning image in and of itself. And so we decided that would be how you would encounter the digital. And what the students came up with was the idea of, we would use that as the sort of landing page for the digital publication, but then we would mark it up. We would geo-reference all of the objects in the exhibit, the 33 objects in the exhibit, as well as the 24 essays that the students wrote. And so each student wrote 2 essays. Some of the essays were about objects, so they're very object-based, about a Chatham Square daguerreotype, one of the first streetscape daguerreotypes in existence for New York. Others were more thematic about how to navigate the streets of New York. There was immense literature, visual as well as textual, on how to get from one side of this Broadway to the other, meaning how to get across without getting run over, which seemed to be quite perilous and came up for endless discussion, and was often represented by a burly policeman carrying a woman across the street. So we had some of those. So we geo-referenced all of the different spaces. What we didn't end up in this, was that this also had these various cartouches embedded in the image, and the students wanted to replace those with different images and have another layer of interpretation on top, but that we decided not to go. And so each object had also an explanation which would allow you to sort of either go to the object page in the digital publication or go to the particular essay. And so you can see here, And this took a long time to decide on what the pins should look like and how this should work. And this is all done with chips as well. And so you can see here, and this is one particular essay by Zahava on the spectacle of downtown Broadway. So this is one of the more thematic essays. And so I think, this was really, I think what we were really committed and what I was really interested in doing is presenting an early piece, at least in my mind, of an effort to do spatial history. I think this is really an important problem facing a lot of historians. I'm a historian, social and cultural historian. Historians really love chronologies. Chronology is the basic, we get from one day to another. It's really a nice spine to tell a narrative story. But this was a story that was increasingly about different uses of space, how New York differentiated itself, how work and residence became separated, how different businesses, whether it be the printing trade or the furniture trade, occupied different sections of Manhattan, and that differentiation occurred. But how clusters of similar-minded artisans worked in contiguous streets even, so that you got not giant factories like you would in the Lowell Mills, but you got multiple numbers of smaller institutions which all work together, supplying each other with valuable goods. And so that's what you can start to see even in, this is where, Fulton Street, and this is Broadway and Ann. So you can see the sort of wealth of, of institutions in this particular place and all the sort of pins that came together. And then I guess and so, we can talk more about this in the discussion, since I think I'm.
If you want to navigate the website.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was gonna. So. And so here you can sort of see, so on visualizingnyc.org, you actually have this particular, and so again, you can sort of see when we move in to these different areas, you can sort of see just the number here in the sort of lower part. And so the essays, in Barnum's Museum here, and again, so the essays are available for download as well. And it's hard to. And then there are also the two interactives as well. So this text actually takes more time to sort of go through this, but I think you can see the wealth of materials with the essays, the objects from the exhibit. And I think the last piece, which is very important, is that this was built on a WordPress platform that is open-ended so that we can add in subsequent iterations of the course or subsequent focus gallery projects. And this was, although it made it more complicated, this was very important because this is going to be primarily it's going to be a vehicle for my research as well as my teaching for some time. In fact, I've signed up to do another focus gallery project on the 1853 Crystal Palace. So that'll go into this. So hopefully we'll then collaborate with other cultural institutions in New York. We're not the only ones doing the history of New York City. You'll be shocked to know. And so the point would be we should really be building bridges to other institutions to try to put collections together as well as interpretations of those collections. And so that's what this is really an early stage project. So let me go back.
Crystal Palace in Paris?
The 1853 New York Crystal Palace. So that's the one that's in Bryant, where what later became Bryant Park. And so I think for the last, I just quickly wanted to gesture, and Kimo and I could talk about this later in the discussion, is this semester, just to show you that we keep working on things here, Kimo and I are teaching for the third, fourth, whatever time, a workshop course on the artifact in the age of new media, which is an effort really to sort of workshop with students what new digital tools are out there, what is contemporary current practice with museums in terms of digital exhibitions or social media, doing a sort of survey of the field. And in the last 2 iterations of the class, we've really focused a lot on mobile apps and handhelds, which is, and I don't think I need to explain to you why, but it is an important means of trying to sort of prototype with students. And so this year we actually did with Paco Link and Amelia Peck at the Met a series of projects on prototypes for potential for a period room app for the Met. So we worked looking at period rooms, and then the students in the class of 6 students each chose a different role in terms of what their prototype would look like. So Eglantine, who's here. And I'm not doing justice to any of these projects. They're just 2 or 3 slides, which, so again, we could ask questions later. Came up with a wonderful idea. Her role for her potential visitors was a tourist. That's okay, tourists could be bombarded with lots of information, but she came up with a really interesting idea of using the app as an invitation to a social event. Because what would normally be held in a lot of these period rooms, they would have been dining, entertaining, dances, and other. And so you select an invitation. You can then select that by means. There are several ways to navigate this. She, like a lot of the other students, came up with multiple ways of sort of having visitors figure out what they wanted to do in those period rooms, how they wanted to pick them out. So you see by period, by theme, by location. And geography here. And then, and I only picked this one slide, if you selected the Powell room, you could actually do multiple things. I think tea was only one of the potential activities, and then there were multiple things you could do in terms of dancing, having tea, what the dress code would be, food, dining, and so on. And so all these involved learning a certain amount of social codes that were involved in terms of what was proper, refined activity. So these are, I took this to be, maybe I'm incorrect, took this to be a very playful and engaging way of getting visitors to really learn quite a bit about the period rooms according to the sort of social codes of whether it be 18th century France or 17th century New England, and engage with the objects in those rooms, even if some of them are imaginatively repurposed and put in there. So again, I think this would work really well with someone who wanted to learn about American or French culture and see these rooms as props for social activity, which is what they are. But they're also props. Other folks worked on the rooms as props for curatorial fantasy as well, which they were. In the early 20th century, they were props for Americanization, how to teach immigrants what being an American might be like. And then Carlin, who's here as well, came up with another idea. His audience would be researchers. So this is a very different kind of group. And so he put together, again, trying to sort of puzzle out which of the different rooms would be available for a researcher. It would be a connoisseur, museum person, someone who's interested, researcher in decorative arts, picking out, again, culture, century, region, swiping through this. This was a real tension. We initially started out with lots of information that we wanted to convey, and iPad seemed like a better bet in terms of we could stuff more onto those screens, and we were sort of firmly told no, that a phone, handheld, would really be the logical platform. And then I think what's also really interesting in Carlin's, and again we can talk about this more later, would be allowing those researchers to work actually out from the Met collection to other collections by use of social media and other means of communication, really sharing. This would have to be sort of pre-populated with a minimum, medium level of information by Met museum folks, but then the hope would be that it would be then a platform for additional information at a fairly expert level. And that, I guess, is another issue of what goes in and what doesn't go in, and how you keep out the riffraff, so to speak, from populating it with misinformation or because, again, that would drive people away. So, again, really ingeniously thinking about what the current state of apps that are out there, trying to sort of differentiate, again, according to the specific, what was so valuable was the real life experience here, like folks went to the Met and walked around those period rooms, I understand, and stood in them and tried to decide what would I want to add here? What would work in this particular room? So it had a realistic element, just like, and finally trying to sort of deal, some of these are maybe more fantastic in that we don't exactly know how we would do this. It wasn't our charge to build these, fortunately. It was really just sort of think hard about what some of the issues we've been talking about the last day and a half are, about what visitors' expectations are, how do we use really rich museum collections, and how do we sort of push the envelope of present-day technology to sort of do the kind of things that we want to do. So thank you.
I think maybe we'll just have time for a couple of questions, because I feel like if we get to the big discussion,
Yeah.
we'll miss anyone who might have a specific question for David. So if we can do 2 or 3 questions, and then I'll go.
Just interested in the way that you're thinking of it, it seems to me, unless I'm misinterpreting, as an educator, as a faculty member, which is different than when we were talking about this morning, which is a museum producing, professional content, or, I don't know, but I'm struck by how the practice in the professional world of creating apps or curating exhibition spaces is becoming central to your teaching. So I'm wondering, we were talking about the role and the importance of objects, if your work would be different without a collection, because it seems like none of this would happen if you didn't have an application or, specific objects, or if you're in New York with these kind of collections you can work with. So the question in here is, how do you think your thinking as a teacher has shifted or changed or been influenced by working with collections and thinking about museum practice?
Or actually, I'll answer by saying I was trying to do so. I mean, my inclination before I came to the BGC, when I taught in the history department, would be I wouldn't worry about those problems. Just could dream it up. But in real life situations, so when we worked with Amelia and Paco, Amelia's, decorative arts curator in the American wing of the Met, we were working with these real period rooms. So you couldn't just do any old thing. But from what I gather of real life practitioners, that's a really valuable lesson. I mean, on the other hand, we didn't have to build it. So there's a mix of, that's why I was saying, sort of fantasy and reality. But I want my students, and I think they want too, to sort of work in somewhat real life environments. And I think and in this case, given their interests and the purposes of the institution, it should be object-based work. That's why when I mentioned earlier about the focus gallery and apologizing for the text-heavy early versions, these are also academic exercises. So it's a dance between trying to, how many digital tools can Kimon and I teach in the artifacting age of new media? We're not just teaching digital tools, so we can't just do 5 a week for 12 weeks and call it a day. We have to pick and choose. On the other hand, we can only ask students, but on the other hand, the great value in the Visualizing 19th Century New York is, and what I really felt strong about was in the middle iteration, was having the students go every other week to the NYPL, because I really wanted them to, and it sometimes was a bit of a push. All the stuff's on the digital gallery. It's really great. Everything looks really cool there. They're all the same size, or whatever the media might be. But you really need, first of all, not everything's digitized, even at the NYPL. And second, the experience of opening those guidebooks, pulling out the maps, and sort of seeing what the scale might be, or even if there's marginalia or ways that the books were used, which they found, that's really important. So it's really, I think the challenge as an educator is there's like 17 different things one wants to do, ranging from the technology to understanding the technical processes of the objects to the social history of New York. And it's more than you can ever possibly do 1, 2, 3, or 4 semesters. And so it's really tough, but I guess that's, it's just, so that's really the challenge. Corbin?
One, I just want to say, I think that the visualizing New York City. The digital publication is gorgeous. Well done. I mean, it's just lovely. And I can't emphasize how much just even the typography of it communicates a certain care and thought that went into it. I was really impressed with it. But I want to, yeah, there we go. There it is. Actually, if you could go to the one slide again, back the other way. There we go. But I was thinking about the interface here and how you were talking about, the sort of spatial history. And one thing that I find in this presentation that gets a little bit lost is that element of time, because we've sort of overprivileged, in a way, the geography a little bit. Can you talk a little bit sort of how you navigated that in the design process and how you, because the time, it's sort of like you can sort of reveal or hide time periods, but it doesn't necessarily give you a sense of that timeline like you were talking about. Or, well, that's my
Well, you
opinion,
can
so.
filter
Yeah.
by time. I mean, and to be honest, maybe the task we took upon ourselves was not as grand as I made out, in that it was sort of 1830 to 1876 or something, or 1824, the Erie Canal opening. So it wasn't all the 19th century, but there was vast changes within that, which was important, which is why we did want to have a sort of timeline filtering, so you could sort of pick out and sort of see which objects. And then it was interesting, we didn't really know what we'd find in advance, just like we didn't spatially. Once we started to georeference, we could see, oh, all these things are falling in this place, or most of the objects also fell in the mid part of the 19th century, and outliers were really, especially in the earlier part, there were relatively few, and in the later, we had two Currier knives lithographs of the city of New York, one from 1856, one from 1876, in the gallery right next to each other. And so 1876 was pretty much the end of the story, and it was a wonderful lithograph that had the Brooklyn Bridge all set up. But Brooklyn Bridge wasn't completed for several years later. So it was a prospect of what the Brooklyn Bridge would look like. So, it's an interesting vision of and the challenge is it's not a history textbook, or it shouldn't be a history textbook. So how much of that story of change over time do you tell without becoming overly didactic? On the other hand, I did want people to know daguerreotype comes from a certain time period, calotype comes from a later period, and if they walked away thinking everything was the same, that would not be good. Or in the case of the print section, the pre-Currier knives were aquatints, or sort of a totally different process. Different migration streams, so sort of British migrants mostly in that, and then the Germans come in the mid-19th century with lithography. So there were so many different other historical stories that changed over time. It's really a challenge. So I don't know. I might say that the historical story in terms of chronology did take a second, a back seat to maybe the spatial, just because of the excitement of doing it this way. The challenge would be, since we built it, would be, okay, let's say we wanted to add 20th century. Well, first of all, our map only goes up to 50th Street, so that would be a problem. Although there's a companion map to this TRIPS map. So these are issues we could talk about later, about the challenges of spatial.
Just one thing, the browse list over there, that puts all the essays chronologically.
Yeah.
If you want to look at it, it's not explicitly that way if you hit that tab, but those essays were listed in there chronologically. And the problem is that the essays are all time spanning, so they overlap a lot. So you couldn't do the pretty dots on a timeline because they end up being this much. Some of the students are covering the whole time period. And some of them are focusing on technology. So I think in this case, the chronography was harder to map than the cartography. The cartography worked as a better point of access for clarity too.
Interesting. Thank you.
Great. So we'll take it.
Yeah.